Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel in the afternoon. It's been an excellent 2 days of panels and discussions here with a lot of different topics being covered. I don't know how much those present today are familiar with the political goings-on in the Western Balkans in general. I'm lucky to be a moderator with a panel of such extraordinary experts, so you're all in great hands with regards to that. But before we start, just a brief, I think it'd be great if I just gave a brief overview of recent events in the Western Balkans that I think the panelists are going to be mentioning and that could be relevant as we talk about Russian influence, but especially in the context of EU enlargement. So unlike Hungary, many countries in the Western Balkans are still on their EU integration, thank you for that, still on their EU integration paths, which means that they're part of a process started with the end of the more or less with the end of the conflicts in that happened with the disintegration of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, but formalized in Thessaloniki in 2003. And this was, this was before the first invasion of Ukraine, before many different events took place in the world and on the continent, where the European Union was much more optimistic about the way, first of all, about expansion, but also, so including new members, but also about the way in which it would influence these countries. There's this euphoria that was part of this process where the EU believed that it could be as thorough as possible in reforming these post-conflict countries and bringing them within the loop of the EU. Precisely because of this investment by the EU, this interest by the EU, from the early days, perhaps not early 2000s, Russia's government at the time was in a different state of mind, but pretty early on, there was an interest on the side of Russia to influence these processes or to influence the Balkans, the Western Balkans, away from the EU. And this is a process that had been fluctuating in intensity depending on Russia's own foreign policy goals. And now we're at a time where Russia is distracted, or more focused, let's say, on the brutal invasion of Ukraine and other, global hotspots that have appeared since then. But it still is a major concern for all these countries, and our esteemed panelists will be explaining this in detail. I will start with Goran Buldioski, who can explain sort of what types of Russian influence exist in the region, perhaps, and give the audience more of a background on where we stand with this right now.
Thank you, and pleasure to be here. Really grateful to be in what was a sister institution when we were here in Budapest a few years ago. So there's a lot to unpack here, and obviously because we had a panel talking about disinformation, one of the champions around the globe is obviously Russia. But I exactly because we had that panel, I would like to bring all of us a bit in a different terrain, and that is the terrain of really look what are the different pathways of influence that Russia has. And actually, when you look at the situation, I will also try to come up, not necessarily because I'm an incurable optimist, but actually with a more cheerful picture than usually we would come on this subject. So first, I will go away from a bit more sophisticated frameworks that you have, soft, hard, sharp power, but then I will spend my 7 minutes to explain them all. Let's talk about Russia as a diplomat, Russia as an investor, and Russia as a meddler. And the first point, Russia as a diplomat, actually brings, in the aftermath of the Ukraine, of their full-scale invasion on Ukraine, actually relatively good news. Except in the corridors of UN, where Russia still wields certain power as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, actually Russia is not present as an actor, not even around the table, but even in the room outside of that table on any of the issues, be that Serbia, Kosovo, be that issues around Bulgaria, North Macedonia, and whatnot. Doesn't mean that that doesn't meddle and interfere, but formally, in the formal space, is not there. Second, Russia as an investor. Now, I'll speak about illicit investor. That's much more potent. But Russia as a formal investor in the Balkans has been already going down, on a pathway down, even before the invasion on Ukraine. So actually already by 2019 the investments were down, and for example, just to give you an illustration, in Montenegro it used to be up to 20%. But the times where oligarchs and billionaires like Oleg Deripaska were investing left, right, and center, I mean, in Montenegro in this case, and some others, are gone. It doesn't mean that Russia does not have some strategic assets. It does, particularly in the energy sector. It doesn't mean that Russia will not do that, but actually because it's overstretched as a formal investor, Russia's influence has really dwindled in the Balkans. Now we come to the third one, where we talk about disinformation. I'm not going to talk a lot about that because my colleagues here on the panel are much more knowledgeable. I will talk more about the context against this happens. First, it's important to think rather in the term of meddler, because others have defined much better this also. It's not only about the disinformation space. It's also about illicit finance that goes in the political system, meaning funding and bribing legally, half-legally, illegally political parties, then actually really flooding the information space and abusing and creating narratives. And then last but not least, it has been tried, and luckily with not a great success, also using political violence, such as the alleged coup in Montenegro and a couple of other isolated cases. So this is like in the toolkit. And here the picture is a bit mixed. So really, if we go through the different countries, I mentioned Montenegro. Once Montenegro was in NATO, you could see immediately, even if there are different actors, even some are pro-Russian, you can see that actually how much there is limited influence to deal with that. Same goes with, for example, North Macedonia. I think Albania and Kosovo are pretty much off the charts, which makes it a very interesting divide inside the region. Where, of course, the issue is very, very potent and still actual, that's in Serbia. That's with Serbian minorities and communities outside. And also all of those countries that consume news that are produced in Belgrade. And they have a very, very significant thing. I come from North Macedonia. Let me take North Macedonia as an example, because it's a really good case where actually you will see from 2008 a massive increase of influence, and it coincides with Macedonia not being accepted in NATO. A long name dispute, and then basically feels the pattern. You have a problem which is not necessarily Russian or not caused by Russia, but a potent problem that could be used, and then you have a massive influx of intervention. And then the pattern goes. Every problem that you have, whether there's a negotiation about the name and changing the name, PRESMA agreement, be that now up till today basically constitutional crisis, you see the same narratives going there. Now, what's interesting about this is that Russia, in some ways, there's always the pro-Russian overtones and undertones, but actually it serves a lot of potent narratives that are consumed locally. In this case, actually, what I would like to emphasize, it very nicely marries together with Serbian nationalism. And probably one does not explain too much. I mean, Serbia is not so far away. You have a lot of pictures between the leaders of this country and that country. But it's very interesting how that actually marriages. And then that's actually also my point. Now, even we see not a recession, but simply the volume of activities cannot be maintained, almost some of the local leaders don't need Russia, or they would rather invent it as a meddler because they need it and they perpetuate it itself. Because some of those narratives, whether it's pro-Russian and whatnot, would be peddled even just for the interest of, I mean, I use Serbian nationalism as the most obvious, but let's say when we go in Macedonia, it's a good example where you have marginal players, a very small party that is not even part of the parliament, but is able to splurt narratives. Party Levica, that nominally is a left-leaning, but basically living out of Russian money, in the parliament, minority player, but again, very important influencer. And I think we go into that And I would like to conclude, in a way, what today Russia tells us is rather more speaking about the weaknesses of the approach by, let's say, the West. I mean, this means European Union and United States, first and foremost, because, interestingly enough, some of those interventions also have, maybe they have not bought in the narrative, but they operate as if the narrative is so strong. And there is no bigger example than the current debate of how much, you know, not only that Serbia is in the center, but how much one has to curb Serbian nationalism, Serbian narratives, in order to build a stability in the region. So I'll stop at that. I probably put a lot of things, but accounting that my role was more to set the ground, and colleagues will fill in with a lot of insightful details. Thank you.
No, that was excellent, Goran, because I think you got very quickly to the heart of the issue. We only have 1 hour. I think all of us could talk about this for extended periods of time. But one thing that you mentioned as a trend, both with North Macedonia, Serbia, and other places, is that Russia has, over the years, been very good at using existing ethnic cleavages, political cleavages, even ideological cleavages that exist in the Balkans, whether they're, you know, whether it's Serbian nationalism in Serbia and places that in the region such as Montenegro or Bosnia that have a significant Serbian minority or ethnic group, or whether it's you know, opposition parties such as the left-wing party in North Macedonia and even the former ruling party, which sometimes engages in pro-Russian narratives. I think this is a perfect segue to Anton, who has not, of course, his work needs, Anton Shekhovtsov's work needs no introduction, but specifically, I think you can make a great connection between the way narratives, Russian disinfo narratives and malign narratives are used both, you know, in the speeches made by Kremlin leaders and so on and so forth, but also online, and how this connection is formed, especially with countries like Serbia.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers as well for the for this invitation. I will focus on Serbia, and I want to start with almost a personal note, or because one of the people involved in the case that I want to start with is a friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is now jailed in Russia for, I think he got even more than Alexei Navalny, and in mid-May 2021, Interior Minister of Serbia, Aleksandar Vulin, went to Russia and met with Nikolai Patrushev.
He's currently the head of the intelligence agency, which is even worse.
But at that time he was still the Interior Minister, and he went to see Russian, the Secretary of the National Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, also one of the major, you know, major figures in the Russian intelligence, counterintelligence, and they, of course, discussed the future of Serbian-Russian relations. Aleksandar Vulin said that definitely Serbia would not introduce sanctions against Russia. They are not going to take part in this, as he said, hysteria, anti-Russian hysteria, and Serbia would remain militarily neutral. What he meant, what they did not report, at least officially, and this is something that one Serbian newspaper reported, that during the same visit, Aleksandar Vulin also brought tapes of the meeting that was held by Russian opposition activists in Belgrade, and was apparently wiretapped by the Serbian security services. I'm sure that actually Russians probably did not even ask to do that, but they did this on their own volition, and they brought those tapes to Russia and gave that to Patrushev. And two people who were involved in that meeting, I'm sure they did not discuss anything really violent or revolution in Russia. If some of you are familiar with the Russian opposition forces, they are not really violent types. And they were arrested. Andrei Pivovarov, a Russian opposition activist, he was arrested 2 weeks after that particular incident, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, whom I mentioned, he was arrested the next year. But this is just to show you what country, yeah, or what political establishment we are dealing with. But Serbia, in my opinion, it remains one of the most pro-Russian countries among other Western Balkan countries. But despite this fact that it's essentially very pro-Russian, Russia still maintains its own malign influence operations there. And I especially want to highlight 3 areas where I think that Russian influence is particularly strong or at least significant. One area is the energy policies, energy politics. Another area is socio-political initiatives, and then the media space. So let me start with energy policies. The Russian energy presence has been very strong in Serbia since 1992. But in 2007, during the second presidential term of Vladimir Putin, he essentially started even more actively promote investments, Russian investments in Serbian infrastructure related to the energy sector. And partly it was because he and the Kremlin, as such, the Russian elites wanted to put pressure on Ukraine. Because also Ukraine was also a very important Ukrainian infrastructure was also very important in transporting energy supplies, oil and gas, especially gas, from Russia to Europe. So in order to put pressure on Ukraine that it's not a sole and transfer country, so that was behind the, at least partly behind the agenda of the so-called Kremlin energy offensive in the Western Balkans and Serbia especially. Serbia has been almost totally dependent on Russian energy supplies for a very long time. But I must say that in recent months, Serbia there is some sort of modification in the Serbian approaches towards Russian energy supplies. Although, as you may imagine, this long dependence on Russian energy supplies created a network on both sides of people who have vested interests in actually maintaining Serbia's dependency on the Russian gas supply. With Russia, I think it's understandable, yes, they want this, but also in Serbia itself, there are people who want Serbia to remain dependent, almost totally dependent on Russian energy supplies. So this is about, briefly about energy policy. Socio-cultural sphere. Russia maintains a wide range of online and offline initiatives in Serbia that are often operated by the Russian diplomatic staff. These initiatives operate in a favorable opinion climate and use various tools and organizations, including the Orthodox Church, to fuel Serbian grievances against the West, to prevent Serbia's closer cooperation with the EU and NATO. They manipulate historical narratives, they try to promote so-called traditional values and conservative attitudes or ultra-conservative attitudes in Serbia. And there is a growing number of those initiatives. Again, I'm circling back to what I said, despite the fact that Serbia is already one of, well, the most pro-Russian country in the Western Balkans, the number of those initiatives is growing. And again, mostly anti-Western, anti-EU narratives. This is what they are spreading. And of course, the another narrative, the anti-American or anti-Western narrative, these are sort of negative narratives, and the only positive narrative here is that Russia, as an older brother of Serbia, is always there to help Serbia, to support Serbia, unlike the treacherous West. And then the media space. This is actually quite interesting. So, two major outlets, media outlets of the Russian Federation, controlled and sponsored by the Russian state, are present in Serbia. This is Sputnik, Serbia, and now RT Balkan. And RT Balkan, this is the edition of RT, formerly known as Russia Today, that was launched in 2022. And that was not, that was actually quite interesting because it was also the year when RT was blocked in the EU. Yeah? And the same year they launched, and quite successfully, the website of RT Balkan. And this Sputnik Serbia and RT Balkan, it's almost a business. It's almost a family business, because Sputnik Serbia is its editor-in-chief is, if I'm not mistaken, Ljubinka Milincic, and her daughter is the editor-in-chief of RT Balkan. So it's really like a family business. What's interesting about those media initiatives and media projects is that their budgets are huge. They're really huge budgets. But at the same time, and also there is a keen interest in Russia, in the developments around Russia and in Russia, in the Serbian society. But there is these media. They are obviously Russian, despite the fact that, again, Serbian nationals are editing or are editors-in-chief of those media projects. Nevertheless, many stories, news stories, are written by Russians, and who very often lack knowledge of what is going on locally. So sometimes they are not in this context. They cannot be considered as really authentically, Serbian media. So they have this. It's almost like in a way, ghetto for them. They are so obviously not only pro-Russian, but they act, or they are perceived, are seen in Serbia as essentially mouthpieces of the Kremlin. Yeah, although in some other countries, RT is being more creative. They do try to involve as many local journalists as possible. So RT or Sputnik would look like a really authentic media outlet. This is not the same with these Russian media in Serbia. But at the same time, these media, they remain important references for the Kremlin's positions on various issues, on Ukraine, on what is happening in the Balkans, what is happening in Russia. In my opinion, it remains to be seen whether, I think Goran will agree with me that many Western Balkan politicians, but also Serbian politicians, are in a way quite pragmatic. So if they at some point decide to take a more pro-European turn, maybe they will do something about this Russian influence. But actually I think that if Russia maintains this influence as it has today in the wide range of areas, starting with the media, but also with the energy policies, maybe these pro-democratic developments will not be that easy. Even if Serbian politicians would like to go in that direction. And in the end, I want to stress that, especially since the start of the as Ukrainians call it, big war, Russian big war against Ukraine in February 2022. Moscow aims, of course, even more aggressively to block the EU integration of Serbia, in particular, but also in general, Western Balkan countries, integration into the EU. And it does so not only through socio-political, socio-cultural initiatives, not only media, not only weaponization of energy policies, but also through attempts, as Una mentioned, attempts to escalate ethnic and religious tensions, already existing conflicts in the Western Balkans and in Serbia in particular, using radicals, using extremists, ultra-nationalists. And of course, Russia is not offering any new or any alternative security or economic framework for the Western Balkans in general, and in Serbia in particular. It's only interested in destabilizing the region. It is very important region for Russia, specifically because it feels that the Balkan region has a significant geopolitical position, and it wants to still take control over the tensions that may arise or may go down, but the ability to control the tensions, this is what Russia is very much interested in, and this is why it is still increasing or trying to increase its presence formally and even informally, even illegally and illicitly in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very extensive. I'd just like to add an anecdote to your, I'm glad you mentioned Sputnik and Russia, RT Balkans. So when RT Balkans was set up, we were all very worried because, this was right after the full-scale invasion, and why was there a new drive to, you had Sputnik, you had a lot of Serbian pro-government television was initially reporting on the invasion in a largely, not evidently, but a largely pro-Russian way, and so on and so forth. And we were like, why do they need RT Balkans? And they did hire initially a slew of editors, which were like very high-profile, sort of Serbian some of them nationalists, some of them less so, journalists. And so it's, as you said, it had a certain level of success. But one thing that was really funny a couple of months ago, or a month or so ago, they had, because you said that the stories that are written by the Russian journalists or that come in from Russia are not edited to serve the Serbian context, so they were merely being translated. And there were, eagle-eyed independent Serbian journalists caught a lot of articles where when they were referring to ministries or organs or governments, they said, our government, referring to the Kremlin, and our special operation, and our, which, very... You assume that influence operations would be slightly more sophisticated. We'll get back to you, Anton, with several questions. Or actually, let's do this right now, very briefly. I think it would be fair to say that one of the main talking points that Russia uses when it comes, Putin himself uses when it comes to the Balkans relates to Kosovo, and comparing Kosovo to Crimea and the annexation of Donetsk and Luhansk. If you could just briefly touch upon that for people who might not be familiar, why this is such an important talking point for him.
Well, I think it's a difficult question because I think we don't really know what's going on in the head of Vladimir Putin. But I think that for Russia, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia was a very crucial historical moment. I think this is where these optimism or optimistic views of the West was a little bit broken in Russia. So this whole Kosovo thing, I think that many Russians actually, they associated Serbia with Russia. And the fear, I think, was that, so if NATO can do this to Serbia, they can do this to us. And because of how it all ended with the independence of Kosovo, I think for Vladimir Putin, with his very Soviet tradition of whataboutism, I'm sure many of you know, is that the Soviet tradition when Americans or Western observers criticize the Soviet Union, or used to criticize the Soviet Union for some, for human rights violations, the response of the Soviets would be, but what about problems in America? What about slavery? Or what about how you treat black people? And so whataboutism. So what about? So for him it was, I think, even a natural, a knee-jerk reaction to all the criticism against criticism of the annexation of Crimea, and the parallel that he has. Yeah, but what about Kosovo? It was the violent. It was violence. It was an invasion, or not invasion, but attack on a sovereign country, Yugoslavia. So if you can do this, why can't we? It's a double standard. So this is the play that he's playing.
Yeah, I mean, just it is an important talking point that comes up, and a perfect segue to Tanja, which another country that Tanja knows very well is obviously Bosnia and Herzegovina, where there has been a different form of Russian influence. Current Bosnian political leader, Bosnian Republika, yes, entity leader. Bosnia has two political entities, each have a parliament, a government, and so on and so forth. Not get into the details of that. But he's the leader of the Serb majority entity right now, was previously a part of the presidency, the national presidency, or the three-member presidency of Bosnia, Milorad Dodik, but he has been, he was one of the people who, days after the invasion, was the first person to call Lavrov and to talk to him about how, he had his support. And if you could talk about how, Russian influences looked like in Bosnia over the years.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Una, for your kind of like a overview of the situation, because I think it doesn't get discussed outside of the Western Balkans. So we are now in Hungary, and it's quite lovely. And I would be also remiss if I didn't mention the fact that to me it's quite personal to be back at Nada Utsa 15 as a proud CEU alumni. I'm really honored to be invited to the event and to be here and see some of my former professors here. It's quite thrilling to me. But back to Bosnia, and Una, it doesn't come as a surprise that when you were trying to explain the roles that the current or ongoing leader of the governing party in the RS, it's a mouthful. When you talk about Bosnian political system, it's a mouthful. Explaining the political system, explaining the dynamics, the competences, it's a lot. And there's, coming from Washington, D.C., there's a certain level of fatigue when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, which personally pains me, but professionally I'm completely in alignment with the assessment, because Bosnia is an old story, however, is a current spoiler. And when we talk about the foreign malign influence and Russian, if it be, I think in general, any malign influence in a country is really dependent upon two things. One is the structural vulnerabilities, which Bosnia is in abundance of. And the second one is the willingness or indigenous kind of willingness to be a proxy or a willing client and a partner to that same influence. And I think Russia, in case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, has both. And there are a couple of sectors that Anton and Goran had already touched upon, and we've been observing through civil society and the media organization that we support what are the trends and how the evolution of the Russian influence in Bosnia. And obviously, one is the disinformation. I'm not going to belabor that. We heard the panelists previously, and Anton and Goran had already touched upon it. But it is important in the Bosnian context because Bosnia is in this perpetual electoral cycle. The elections in Bosnia, they alternate every 2 years from general to local. So the kind of like campaigning never really ends. And when we speak about disinformation, a lot of our grantees and civil society alike had noted that a lot of the portals that are completely spewing Russia propaganda are popping up just before the elections and are then disappearing. And then it's very hard to track and to follow the kind of like the order of their appearance and their effect. The second area that I would like to discuss is energy, but unlike in Serbia, the RS leadership had been pursuing this willingness to be dependent on Gazprom for a long time. And just as we talk, RS Prime Minister and two ministers, one of Commerce and one of Energy, are visiting Russia to discuss what they called, I believe, New Eastern Connection, which is the new gas line through Bijeljina, through the northeast, running from Serbia to Bosnia, that would further make the country dependent on the gas and energy resource, when the entire EU and everybody else is trying to move away from that, seeing how it really depends on a whim of a one man to cut off an entire nation of the gas in a critical winter. So there's that, and there's evidence out there, and it's all everything. I say it's really publicly available, and civil society has been pretty vocal about it, but it's dangerous. Third sector is really security, and unlike many countries in the region, Bosnia and Herzegovina doesn't have a single national security strategy, rather which encompasses all security threats being from corruption to foreign malign influence to terrorism, far right. These are all kind of sporadically mentioned in various levels, in various documents.
I mean, at some point we have to explain the political system in Bosnia or nobody's going to understand. No, but very briefly, if I may, just interrupt you, you know, the Bosnian post-war order was the Dayton Agreement, which was signed as both to end the fighting, but also set up the post-war. Political order is one of the most complex constitutions in the world, which means that it, I'm jumping in as a journalist who's had to explain this several times throughout her life, so you're going to have to suffer through it with me. But you know, it was meant to be a political system that protected every single ethnic group at every single level, from like the very local municipal ones to the cantonal ones to the entity ones to the, and I'm going to miss a level and so on and so forth. But it has multiplied levels of power, which makes it easy to manipulate. If you have someone who's a negative, you know, wants to be a negative sort of influence on this, and Milorad Dodik and Republika Srpska has been using this quite extensively.
I mean, you said it.
I was just explaining the background because some people might not know.
That the highly decentralized nature of the governing makes governing almost virtually impossible. And also this is why the country is in a constant debate over its geopolitical kind of orientation. But going back to security, which is what concerns me, not only as somebody who works in this space, but also as a Bosnian who has a family and friends there, not having a single document that governs that space is very dangerous. And especially when you have militarized parades organized every January, and when you have, you know, organized crime ties with political elites who are somehow connected with the Russian motorbike groups.
Night wolves, yes.
That you had written about. And then also when you have, with the case of North Macedonia, when there was a wave of kind of expelling and declaring personas non gratas of the Russian quote-unquote diplomats, when North Macedonia puts it kind of diplomatically, saying they weren't really acting according to the Vienna Convention on diplomacy. These people were expelled, and somehow they find their ways accredited in Bosnia and Herzegovina. These are all security risks. So whether it's a huge negligence or incompetence or just a intentional issue, it kind of gives me creeps. And finally, on where Russia in particular has kind of like a very different, I would say, influence, unlike in any other countries, is that a codified, we're seeing this year in 2023, a codified attempt to silence dissent. Earlier in the year, the RS National Assembly had adopted so-called defamation law, criminalizing defamation. A number of civil society groups had kind of submitted requests for constitutionality of the law. As we talk right now, we have another draft law in the procedure, so-called foreign agent law. The civil society had mentioned and had analyzed that it's word for word Russian modeled after Russian foreign agent law, and then there's probably a third law in the working. So you have a codified a way of actually silencing any opposition or criticism which is modeled after Kremlin.
Yeah, exactly. No, Dodik wants to implement his own foreign agent law. That kind of stuff isn't unfamiliar to those who follow events in Russia and elsewhere. Žiga, I'm so sorry you had to wait so long to say
no
something.
problem.
And you have the sort of slightly difficult task of sort of taking everything that's been said and explaining how that affects the EU integration process. Because, you know, if I could just briefly interject, you know, the EU is very heavily involved in the reform processes in the region, yet this Russian influence persists and it exists in one way or another. And or, like Tanja said, Russia similar or like policies that are inspired by Russia keep, you know, cropping up in places like Bosnia, but also Montenegro and to some extent issues with you know, religious authorities and divisions and stuff like that. So how is the EU trying to handle this, and what does that mean?
All right, so I'll try to do my best and wrap everything together and add it, you know, a European perspective. Thanks a lot for organizing this conference, and it's a real pleasure to be on this panel. I thought at the first that actually I'll start at the current events and what's happening on the EU level. But after all these interventions, I feel like I should kind of, follow this path, talking a bit more about the Western Balkans first, and what actually happened in the past 10, 15 years on the European integrational process of those Western Balkan countries. So, I mean, there has been a lot said about the role of Serbia, and I'll just add to everything that Goran, Anton, but also Tanja mentioned. A lot of roads go down to Belgrade when it comes to the path of most of the Western Balkan countries on its European journey. Serbia affects basically directly, obviously, the situation and the future of Kosovo. It affects the future of Bosnia through the Republika Srpska and the connections with Dodik and all the others around. It affects, to a certain extent, the situation in Montenegro with the current political crisis that we've seen in the past couple of years and the influence of the Serb population in Montenegro on, where the country should be heading. And of course, last but not least, it affects Serbia on its own. At the current situation, when looking at the EU enlargement policy, its normative power, the aspects of democratization that it offers, I believe this vision kind of faded away in the past, 7, 8 years. Basically, from when Juncker, taking over the European Commission in 2014, said there will be no enlargement during my mandate. This was a big boomer for a lot of countries in the Western Balkans, because it meant that no matter how they perform, they will not be let in anytime soon. Which obviously, if we look at the nature of Balkan people, they're, I think, very welcoming, but also very frank, very direct, and they don't like to be lied to. And this wording of Juncker at that time really kind of went against everything that was promised from 2003, from Thessaloniki summit, up until 2014 to some of the Western Balkan countries. So from then on, we actually started seeing this fatigue of the European enlargement, EU enlargement policy towards the Western Balkans. We've seen French veto, a new methodology, Bulgarian veto towards the North Macedonia, and all of this added up to perception within the Western Balkans that the EU actually doesn't want us to be part of it, one way or another. At the current situation where we are now, we have this new momentum caused by the Russian war in Ukraine, caused by granting the candidacy status to Ukraine and Moldova, two countries that are performing very fast. And although they're at the bottom of the race now, given the political will and the support also from the side of the EU, but more broadly Western democracies, they can outperform the Western Balkan countries very fast, which actually even adds up to this frustration and distrust to some of the people towards what the European project is about. So now, at the current situation, I'll try to be brief on what we should do to change these things around, to make the enlargement policy work for the Western Balkans again, and what are the risks of not succeeding in this. So first and foremost, it's obvious that enlargement is back on the table. It is a political priority now for, I would say, most of the EU member states. For a long time, this was not the case. For a long time, there were member states within the EU that were basically against any further enlargement, and there were countries that didn't really care about it. Now it turned from this democratizational economic ties to the region to the security aspects, and the EU understands that enlargement has to happen to actually, balance the influences in the region, and obviously to protect the region from the malign influenced Russia, but also of China, Turkey, Saudis, all the others.
China would be a completely different panel. We're barely going to get to cover.
I'm not going there, don't worry. So now, first and foremost, what has to really happen is that the EU really commits to this, not only by, some statements of the politicians and representatives of the EU, but also to setting enlargement as a strategic priority for the next Commission. So this is something in the making for the upcoming year. It has to start discussing about if we get all these countries in, and I'm not talking just about the Western Balkans now, but Ukraine and Moldova, obviously, it's a bit of a different process. What the financial framework of the EU will look like in the future. We have to already now, if we're serious about enlarging, we have to count with the numbers of a EU 30+. And of course, last but not least, we have to still maintain, obviously, the merit-based process. We have to stick to the criteria that are set up, but make it work faster, more efficient, and we have to make the EU more engaged in the region. Because if this somehow doesn't happen in the upcoming few years, I'm really worried that we're risking even bigger fatigue, which effectively can completely block the EU enlargement policy in the future. And I'm not even opening the questions connected to Ukraine, its size, country at war, and stuff like that. So I'll try to stop here, I guess, because I guess we don't have much time left, and I'll be happy to answer any of the follow-ups.
I just go to Goran first for responses. I saw you feverishly taking notes. Well, how would you respond to everything that's been said so far? What hasn't been covered?
I mean, first, I would like to get a sense of how much will cost. Western Balkans is the economy of Slovakia or the economy of city of Munich. You choose small. If Western Balkans was added to the bill of European Union, that will cost between 1.60 euros to 10 euros 80 per capita per EU citizen at the moment. So literally, I mean, like, where's the 10 euros? I think even in Hungary, or 3,800 forints and counting, you can put it on the table and say, okay, at least let's not have a headache. Let's not have another debate about the Balkans. But it's more complicated than that. And let me actually focus on why it's complicated and why Hungary, why it's interesting for you. All of the things that we talked, actually Hungary can learn about. Colleagues mentioned the security aspects. They're actually serious. I love Andorsi Street. But there is one part where I always wonder how many floors have been dug down under Andorsi, next to the oldest metro in continental Europe, in the Russian embassy, because the number of Russian embassy staff is increasing every single day. And I think a learning point from the Balkans is that that's not very healthy. Even these are your best friends. And if you don't trust me, then probably Mr. Orban should ask Mr. Vucic. And I think that's a very important point. And we're counting over 500 here. It's actually unprecedented. It's even for the Balkan numbers quite impressive. Second thing, actually Hungary mattered quite a lot. The EU commissioner was appointed Hungarian because at the time it was considered by the Germans that it's totally irrelevant. Let's give a ministry where there will be no harm done. And in order to wake up in today's world where actually you have Dodik going to Moscow, taking nice photos, coming back and taking nice photos with whom? With Oliver Varhey. And actually it becomes now an issue because in this particular commission you have a commissioner that cannot do this. And that's not unimportant in a bureaucracy that actually wants to show that this is a technocratic process. Last thing which is important about Hungary in terms of this everyday sort of functioning thing in political words is also security threat. Even that nothing can compare with what we witness now, the horrors of Ukraine, having another sort of conflict, even if it's a low-intensity conflict on your southern border, you don't want to have. As simple as it is. Last point, a lot of colleagues that deal with this staged accession, the various modalities of countries entering into the EU without having a vote. We forget that all the Central and Eastern European states, all mid-sized countries really watch at this, irrespectively whether they're run by people with authoritarian tendencies, as here, or more democratic setup as somewhere else. Why? Because they're really afraid that if you have tiered membership for the Balkan countries, that's one step to the vision of multiple speed Europe, where actually next in the row will be the Hungaries, the Czech Republics, the Slovaks of this world, to be slotted into that. And that's not actually a technocratic discussion, it's a very political discussion, it's not a naive discussion. And I think it's important that in Budapest also people who are progressive at it. Sorry, I said I like to talk about money, so let me just put one thing. No, the point is we talked a lot about energy, we talked about the smaller Balkan markets. But actually even countries like Hungary and all the Balkan countries, including Serbia, there's like this local interest which count in millions. But what's happening now with Russia being really busy, they have these local operatives which are relatively their own agencies, but the bigger story actually happens through Turkey. And I think the key question will be what will happen with the gas and oil, sort of the entire market that will go through Turkey proper, and how all these small, in a large scale for Europe, all these small gas or oil pipelines or deals will play into the big role, because this is also the way how Western Europe may sort out its own dependency on Russia in the future. And why this is important? It's important because also when you see Vučić and Orban meeting and making all these linkages about oil and gas, it's important because actually none of the small countries, and in this case I would even add Hungary to it, cannot protect itself and cannot think on the energy market. So, and that's why actually I think we should start looking as well at the bigger picture, and all of these smaller pieces of the puzzle may give us some hints of what's happening as well at the level of Turkey, because that will be the fight for billions, and the Western Balkans will have it. And I leave it there because we should have mentioned also Turkey in this conversation when we talk about the Western Balkans.
Again, so many things to talk about. Don't put that down. I have a quick follow-up for you. You or Žiga, or both of you, if you had to, you know, the Western Balkans have the longest experience with EU integration of any country that hopefully wants to become a member. I mean, because countries that are members had much shorter integration processes. What if you could come up with 3 things that, you know, were learned the hard way in the Balkans, that Ukraine and Moldova, maybe Georgia, could consider in their, you know, should not repeat, except for hiring our experts?
The worst lesson is that it doesn't pay off to be a Democrat. Don't ask me, ask Zaev, the former Prime Minister of Macedonia. Because he delivered on everything, and he got nothing in return. And actually the bad lesson was that Vučić could gloat publicly, first privately, then publicly, and say, where are your democratic credentials? That's a very important thing. And I think it cannot be repeated because Ukraine has a very weird leverage, but a very tangible leverage over the European Union, which is not a bad news. But in principle, I think we really have, you know, the values that are really talked about have to be practiced. The second thing is, Žiga talked about the various modalities. Obviously, Ukraine and Moldova will have to have a different modality of negotiation. It's impossible. But when I'm seeing that this is the city of Munich will never become a member of the European Union. That's actually how people in Berlin think. Why shall we give 6 slots where actually we don't give even a slot to Bavaria, which is like a, you know, will be probably bigger than half of the EU members. And I think we really have to think about not only how this is square in terms of governance, but actually where you put because also this is a bit condescending just in economic parameters talk, which are important but not the only ones. And I think we have to also think from the aspect of capacity, because these countries are too small to basically pull off 100,000 pages and counting of a key unless they do copy-pasting exercise. And that's never a good thing when you have to organize your life and your economy on copy-paste.
Žiga, quickly.
All right, I'll try to be brief. No, I just have to follow up on what Goran said. Exactly, the worst thing that actually happened in the Western Balkans in the past few years was exactly the situation in North Macedonia. The North Macedonian government, you know, after the ousting of Gruevski, really speeded up the process and got nothing in return. And this cannot be repeated by the EU, otherwise really we have to wrap up the whole enlargement policy and stop. And And
so Ukraine shouldn't compromise?
No, and I think that's visible that actually Ukraine, unlike the Western Balkan leaders, knows how to push the West to get what they want.
I mean, it's also
it's a bigger country, it's a different situation, obviously, but their diplomatic efforts are incredible. They know what they want and they go for it. And that's in comparison to looking into the situation of Serbia. I mean, currently, I don't see that Serbia could actually join the EU anyhow, because they will never reform in the line of what is expected from them. Because if they do, if they have independent judiciary, what happens to Vučić? Well, he goes to trial. Why would he be doing that?
Isn't Serbia the front runner, though, for EU integration?
Well, yeah, on paper.
Well, with Montenegro, Serbia.
Montenegro closed down more chapters than Serbia, but...
Asylum is an option.
In Hungary, right, yeah.
He's on Rožadom, 3 kilometers from here.
Greetings to Gruevski.
Tanja, again, very briefly before I open to questions so everyone can prepare, I think I have time. The other panel started later, so I'm counting it for exactly an hour with everything. But Tanja, briefly, one thing that Bosnia knows better than any country in Europe, I think, is trying to cover for the rights of ethnic, linguistic, religious groups. And, Ukraine, if it goes through the European integration process, will have to have protections in place for its varied groups. How would you, because the EU requires it, what tips would you give in terms of that? Mistakes that shouldn't be repeated that were made in Bosnia.
That's a really good question. I would just brief comment on the previous,
and of course comments if you have them.
brief comment on what Ukraine and Moldova can learn from Western Balkans. I would actually reverse the question and say, what can EU learn from the kind of failed accession process in the Western Balkans? Because the appetite for the EU enlargement is there. Like when you take a look at the data, 4 years ago the numbers were a little bit starkly worse. Now they're not bad. So like, what can EU actually derive from there? Which brings me also to the point when Ukraine submitting the questionnaire in a record time. They had technical assistance. Bosnia did not. So like, EU has to also proactively step up and kind of walk the talk if the EU enlargement is a foreign policy credo. Back to Bosnia. Look, I mean, to be completely frank, Bosnia is still governed by the constitution that is a part of a peace agreement. There was a perfect military ceasefire.
But maybe, again, I'm not putting anything out there, but maybe that might be a situation that Ukraine might have to face, or something along those lines.
Exactly. Going back to that. So like the peace agreement signed in Dayton, DPA, 95, ended the military conflict in Bosnia. However, one of the annexes of the Annex 5 is actually the constitution of the country. However, what the military leaders at the time and the international community did not think at the time was provisions to actually amend the constitution. And now we're stuck with a perfectly drafted military document that ended the fire and ended the conflict, but it actually kind of disabled the country at the same time 30 years after. So provisions to modify constitution when needed, provisions to build in some of the power sharing mechanisms that are effective and useful. I think that would be one of the ways forward. But I looking at the engagement of the Ukrainian civil society that is at the front line of this, criticizing and scrutinizing the government as they are in the war is absolutely amazing. And I'm personally inspired by the work of the Ukrainian civil society and the media.
Do you have comments before you open to questions?
I wanted to say, and actually follow up on something that was already said, that in my opinion, among many other decisions or policies that the EU could enact in the Western Balkans, one thing is crucial, is that there is not enough EU Stratcom in Serbia. I remember a few years ago, you remember there was this COVID-19 pandemic, and I was looking at how Russia was trying to weaponize the pandemic in order to advance its foreign policy interests. I was looking at Italy. If you remember, there were these convoys of Russian trucks with so-called aid to Italy, but I was also looking at what it was doing in Serbia. It tried the same thing together with China, but what I'm trying to say here is that there was a public opinion poll among in Serbia among the population, and Serbs were asked what country, in their opinion, was doing the most to help Serbia with the COVID-19 related aid. And the numbers or the percentage, what they thought it was China and Russia, and it was the opposite of truth, because the EU did so much more for Serbia than China or Russia, but in the public perceptions, that was Russia and China that were doing much better. So EU needs to be present. You know, as the joke goes, we do not do propaganda. Yeah, it's Stratcom what we do. There is not enough EU Stratcom. There is not enough explanations from the EU side how much the EU has already invested in the region, and in many cases some economic successes that they have those not because of China or Russia, but because of the EU. I'll stop here.
Anton, I'm so sorry. I'm being signaled right, left, and center stop, but can I take 2 questions? It'd be so unfair. Rapid fire. Anyone? Questions? No questions. Okay, then Žiga, do follow up.
I just wanted to quickly follow up on this, Stratcom idea. And really, I mean, when we talk about the influence of Russia or China, especially in Serbia, it's not built on rational thinking. If you would ask Serb, pro-Russian stance, where would they send their kids to school? Russia or EU? They would always say EU. Would they buy Russian milk or EU milk from Germany, for example? They would buy the German one. It's just this emotional sentiment and this myth that actually Russia is the big brother, which was kind of built up by also the propaganda of the government. It's, if we look at the historic facts, I don't think Russia is really a big brother, but it plays well in the cards of the government.
And with that, I think we can wrap up. I was signaled something. Wrap up. I thank you so much, everyone, for trying to cover so many different bases. I think, like I said, this is their entire conference is devoted to this topic, not merely panels, but there was a valiant effort by everyone to cover so much. Thank you again. I think everyone deserves a round of applause. And of course, I encourage you to reach out to the speakers personally if you have additional questions.